Welcome to the start of chapter 45, where we're going to talk about the endocrine system. Now, the endocrine system in general is going to be a lot of what's going to be secreting long distance chemicals. We'll talk a lot about hormones. So, this is going to be how our body communicates from one part to the next. It's going to be a critical part of how that functions. And so, you can see there's lots of different organs that would be part of this system. So, I know sometimes you think, like, oh, endocrine, hormones, it's probably not that involved. When in reality, there's a tremendous number of structures, especially throughout our torso and our head, within the brain especially, that are going to ultimately produce and then be acted upon by these various chemicals that will help control our body. So this will be a critical part of this homeostasis that we've talked about to make sure that our body stays in balance. We're going to keep ourselves in balance chemically. Now, there's technically two types of things that we can discuss that are oftentimes intermixed, and that's the endocrine system and the exocrine. We're not going to focus too much on the exocrine system. This one's more focused on a lot of stuff like digestion, mucus production, sweat production. These are going to be glands that produce chemicals, but they secrete them via ducts or like a tube or an actual specific pore. So that's why we'll say like the mucus stuff in your stomach and your nose, that's going to produce mucus that it then secretes via this little duct onto the surface of your skin. Same with sweat or anything else. You also have a bunch of stuff like your pancreas, for instance. It actually does both of these. But your pancreas will produce a bunch of digestive enzymes, which it dumps into a duct that it shares with your gallbladder, which holds bile. That's also something that helps break down food or emulsify fat. So those will both be dumped into this duct that then dumps it into your intestines, your small intestine specifically, where it can then break down food. So these are normally going to have different types of tasks. They have more of like a job that they serve for us. Whereas the endocrine functions, these guys don't have a duct. They're typically going to be secreting things mostly into fluids, most commonly blood. So these are going to go long distances and trigger something else to happen. A lot of our exocrine stuff does something directly. You produce a specific enzyme that's a peptidase. It's going to help try to break down proteins and amino acids. You produce something that specifically is mucus. That's going to try to trap bacteria. It's going to try to keep things moist. It's going to try to protect things from acid in the stomach. It's got an immediate job. Whereas this stuff's going to be much more just like signals, where it just lets our body know what conditions are like, what it should do based on the conditions. It triggers other stuff, just like if I yell at you, you might jump, or I could say run and you might run. I'm not actually like physically picking you up and running with you, but I'm getting the point across. Now, before we get into hormones, which is really, like I said, for the end of the chapter where we're heading, before we get there, I want to make sure you realize, though, that within our body, I want to review signals, especially in animals, although this applies for just about anything that's multicellular. So if you remember back, we have these local regulators, which are things that are going to be secreted and used in pretty much the same area. So these are not signals that are going to be going long distance. That's the endocrine signals. So they're being produced in kind of like cell A, and they're being used by like cell Z. There's a gap there. Whereas there's other types, autocrines probably the simplest in terms of the cell produces a signal that it responds to itself. So this would be like me talking myself through something. Ultimately, nobody else around me is affected. This is just me affecting myself. So that would be autocrine, auto yourself. Then we've got paracrine and synaptic, which are fairly similar, actually. Paracrine is going to be like, instead of me talking to myself, if I yell, if I go through and say fire while we're in that theater, which you shouldn't do. But if I go through and shout something, or if I say free money and everybody starts running over, everybody in the neighborhood, everybody in the nearby vicinity can, and in some cases will, respond to it, assuming they have the right chemical receptors. You have to have a receptor to be able to detect it. So this one's going to be the equivalent of that shouting. So this can affect many cells, but only the ones that are nearby. Whereas synaptic is going to be where I release chemicals and it will affect another cell. But for this one, it's not as broad. This one's much more specific. So I release chemicals, but I release it almost directly to this other person. So instead of me going, and I guess if you want to think of this paracrine thing, it'd be a lot like if I had something, let's say tennis balls. The paracrine would be like if I just start throwing them out all over the place, so anybody nearby could potentially get hit by one or catch one. With synaptic, it'd be much more where I'm going to not directly, I'm not going to sit there and merge somehow with somebody else. There is going to be a gap there. but that gap's going to be tiny. So it's kind of like you putting your hand here and me putting my hand here, and then I just kind of throw and drop just a little bit. So there's very little actual distance that that signal has to travel, but it still will go essentially from cell A to B to a different cell that's really close by. It's not the same cell. Whereas for a paracrine type system, it can go from A to B, to C, to D. I can keep going, but anybody that's kind of in the nearby area, they can all get hit. And then autocrine, obviously, in this scenario, would just go from A to A. It doesn't actually leave. So autocrine yourself, paracrine everybody nearby, so to speak, synaptic some specific person nearby. And then within our body, we have a variety of these guys that will be functioning. You have growth factors that oftentimes will fall under this paracrine thing, although you can have some that'll also fall under the other autocrine type functions if they receive some signal by the own cell, essentially. If it detects something as a cell, it can respond to it by producing things like growth factors. You have nitric oxide, which is a good one because this acts in a variety of different ways. So this one can actually be a neurotransmitter. And neurotransmitters, all of them essentially, will be synaptic. So it'll be one of these guys. But it also does other things. It can cause vessel dilation, so it can cause your blood vessels to open up. It can also cause cell death. If you have too much nitrous oxide, you can actually damage the cells and cause them to die. So that gives you a sense, too, that sometimes with the chemicals in our body, you've got to keep in mind that too little can be a terrible thing, too much can be a terrible thing, and in between can be awesome. And so for this one, it depends upon which cell it's interacting with as to exactly what effect it'll have. And under really high concentrations, it can have, we'll say, a deleterious effect. And then prostaglandins, these guys I bring up just because there's lots of them that are used in our body, but they have wildly different functions. They're basically all sharing in common the fact that they're just modified fatty acids. And so just like we had a bunch of hormones or modified cholesterols, it's going to be the same idea here where we modify a bunch of these and they tend to serve a lot of like paracrine type functions. And we usually just name them, so you might say like prostaglandin A, B, C, D, E, F, etc. Because there's, like I said, a lot of them. So I won't make you know specifics, but I want you to realize that there are a lot of these local regulators that are functioning and helping us function within our bodies. So don't assume that these guys are rare or anything. There's lots of different neurotransmitters that would be synaptic alone. There's lots of different paracrine and autocrine signals that are used. So I'm just giving you some examples to give you a sense that this is a big deal. Now, because we don't have years and years and years, we're going to kind of focus. So most of this chapter is going to focus now on hormones. And their main thing is that they're going to be produced in one place by something called a neurosecretory cell. They're then typically dumped in our blood, in our bodily fluids, typically blood. It could, I suppose, in some cases be interstitial fluid for parts or lymphatic fluid, which is similar to blood. But typically we'll just say blood. And then from there it'll eventually be received by a target cell. And remember, the target cell, the whole important thing is it has to have the proper receptor. With hormones, they can have different effects in different types of cells because you use a different receptor. So if you use a different receptor, or if you have a different transduction process as to how we respond to it, you can get a different response. Just like some cells can have no receptor, so they're essentially deaf to that hormone. So you don't hit puberty and the same thing happens all over your body. You have different areas that respond differently, whether it's by doing meiosis, growing hair, lengthening of your vocal cords. It's not like every part of your body's doing the same thing. There's specialization because we have these different target cells with potentially different receptors and certainly different transduction and response pathways. And we use hormones a lot because they help us with feedback control. If we have something happen to our body that we detect, we have to somehow relay that information to get the appropriate response, usually a negative response, to counteract it, to stay at homeostasis. And so for this process, it's critical that we can release the appropriate hormones to get ourselves back to where we should be so we can live. And so within our body, most of what is keeping us maintained is going to be these chemical signals. Hormones obviously work well long distance, but also a lot of these hormones will trigger stuff like the local regulators to make sure our cells know what to do, to trigger the appropriate response in those cells so we can continue to live. Now, the last two things I'm going to do here is just kind of a review of how hormones can act. So the first type is going to be plasma membranes, where we're going to have a receptor that's embedded in that membrane. And so something's going to come along, And this, I just listed some stuff here that functions this way: neurotransmitters, growth factors, most hormones. So some of these guys aren't hormones, but they still use the same pathway. So if you're made out of anything other than a steroid usually, so a lot of these will actually be like proteins, although sometimes they're fatty acids, etc. But if they are large enough or if they're polar enough that they can't get through the cell membrane, they will have a receptor that's actually embedded in the cell membrane. And so once they do that, they'll bind to the receptor. That normally triggers a change in the receptor that activates somebody else. It could be an enzyme that produces secondary messengers like the adenylyl cyclase that makes cyclic AMP. It could trigger the release of calcium, which would be a secondary messenger. It could activate a phosphorylation cascade, if you remember, where a bunch of these kinase proteins add phosphates to other proteins, which then activates them. And so you get this cascade of activated proteins until eventually we get a response, which is typically going to be turning on an enzyme, either within the nucleus or in the cytoplasm, or in many cases it will have to do with inside the nucleus, will trigger either transcription, so turning on a gene, or we will stop transcription. So we can essentially turn a gene on, or we can turn a gene off. And so that's just some of the common responses that you'll get. But this one's going to be the more involved one, where you've got reception, transduction, and then the response. But it's going to be a gap there because we're going from the membrane, oftentimes inside the nucleus. But there are some hormones that are steroids. That's the most common types. There's some others, but if they are nonpolar and if they are small enough, they can go through the membrane, they can go through the cell, they can go oftentimes through the nuclear envelope. And so they can actually bind to stuff within the nucleus to cause change. And so these guys don't have to, there still is some guy that's receiving something typically. There still can be some minor amount of transduction, but they skip most of what would be like the receptor and the transduction phase because they can do most of it like themselves. Instead of you having to relay the information through the doorway because you can't get in, this is just like you can walk in. You can pretty much directly deliver the message so you get the result you need. So this will be done by, once again, nonpolar stuff, things that can get through the membrane, oftentimes will have their receptor, will have the start of this process occur, in some cases at the actual inside of the nucleus. It doesn't have to be on the cell membrane, but it usually is.